Services stopped here this afternoon. A big regional station like this silenced by the strikes. We've still seen passengers turning up. Some have said to us they didn't know there was a strike on. Others that they have no choice but to travel today. One man said to me, not everyone has the luxury of working from home. But we still found sympathy amongst some for the strikers and why they're taking action in this time of the increased cost of living. People said they had sympathy for why people felt they needed to strike. And the unions will be relying on that public goodwill because this is an increasingly fractious dispute with both sides swapping very cross words. The government has been particularly critical of the unions, and Grant Shapps has written articles recently saying that he'll use emergency powers to try and prevent future strikes. That hasn't gone down too well, as you can imagine, with the unions. They're saying that they'll continue to agitate for better pay and conditions. And the government itself has been criticised for its levelling up agenda when it comes to transport. Because here in this region, as I've been finding out, it's not just the trains in trouble.
Birmingham Street has been cancelled. This is due to industrial action.
A train ride to nowhere.
The country apologises for the inconvenience this may cause you.
Another day of disruption with just a fifth of services running.
I had to miss a couple of jobs, disappoint a few clients, and a lot of my work basically has gone backwards instead of forward. So the strike has really impacted me.
Something that will take me 25 to 28 minutes from Barnsley. It has taken me almost an hour and a half.
So how are you feeling about the strike?
Not good.
A sixth day without pay for workers on the picket line. They're striking over wages, job cuts and changes to terms and conditions. Network Rail says it wants the union to put its latest offer to a ballot of its members. The two sides are in a face-off, with still no sign of a settlement.
We are saying that we need to make efficiencies. We've identified around about 10% of frontline maintenance roles that we would be looking to save through voluntary redundancy means. And we want to do that, and we want to do that by working with the RMT. It's not compulsory redundancy.
We never thought this would be a quick dispute to resolve because the government is entrenched. What we need is a change of the weather and a change of mood from this government. They have locked these companies into a dispute the companies can't actually resolve.
The government has suggested it could use emergency powers to block future strikes, but it's come under criticism itself over its transport policy. It's not just the train strike that's affecting people who live and work in South Yorkshire. There's been a huge political row here about the future funding of buses. Passengers are facing the biggest cuts to services in a generation after it was announced that government funding offered during COVID won't be renewed in October. Many here have been left feeling that there's little sign of the levelling up that they'd been promised. Despite Boris Johnson's promise of a £3 billion bus revolution, a third of services here stopped running in July after no private operator bid for the contracts. And then another 19 services were axed when the company Powell's went bust.
Powell's buses, they're knocking them off altogether.
Eileen Glue relies on the buses to get her out of the house.
I went out at 10:15 and they're not. This bus was stopped at Wickersley. It says, I'm stopping here, I'm not going any further, I'm only going to 10 yards. Because, we're pensioners now, we rely on buses. But my service used to be one at best. It's one at worst now.
Look how far away we are from a London-style transport system.
What's going on with the buses here? Because it's dire for people who live and work here every day and rely on the services.
Well, look, I use the bus. I get about by bus in South Yorkshire just like everybody else, and we need a better service. We need the government support to make that happen.
But isn't it your responsibility to provide that as the mayor?
Look, absolutely, and we're doing everything we can to make that happen, but we do need the support from this government.
And Grant Shapps has criticised you personally today for failing to condemn the rail strikes. What do you say to that?
He's very happy to criticise me, and what I've said is that people who are taking action because they need to feed their kids or heat their homes deserve our support. They deserve a pay rise.
And those pay rises are now being demanded by other unions. In Edinburgh, bin workers started a 12-day strike after rejecting an offer of 3.5%. There's been a political debate about whether wage demands will fuel the inflation crisis, but unions say they'll keep pushing for rises that reflect the soaring cost of living. Tomorrow there'll be walkouts across London's transport system, followed by another national rail strike on Saturday. with unions warning that over the coming months, the UK could face a series of strikes in other sectors. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Sheffield.
Well, in the thick of this long, hot summer of bitter recriminations and stalemates, maybe you're asking, how will this all end? When will it ever end? Perhaps the answer lies deep in the past, about half a century ago. What can we learn from the 1970s? A decade remembered now for some great music, some very bad hair, and years of industrial strife. The sounds of the 70s echoed loudly today. At the height of the strikes, 30 million working days were lost to industrial action in just 1 year. That was the shivering winter of discontent. It foreshadowed our very own sweltering summer of discontent. Then, as now, a geopolitical crisis, an energy shock, a cost of living emergency.
Some said it was like the war.
And unions asking why should normal people pay the price for spiralling inflation.
Finding your shopping more expensive this year?
Oh yeah, definitely.
What things?
Well, night dresses for children, £1.12. I used to pay about, most was 18 shilling for a child of 3.
The unions called out millions of public sector workers. Coal strikes led to an underlit 3-day week. Shopping in candlelight, and not for the romance of it.
This 12-foot-high pile is part...
Barricades of rubbish piled high, and in some cases, the dead remained unburied. The opposition leader, a Conservative, accused the Labour government of missing in action.
Sir Harold and Mr Callaghan and their wretched governments have impoverished and all but bankrupted Britain. Socialism has failed our nation. Away with it before it does the final damage.
The strikers had some short-term success, but there was a reckoning. The following decade saw a raft of anti-union laws, more economic growth, but eventually less secure work with worse pay and conditions. All of which brings us squarely to the very issues at play today. Is the pendulum swinging back all the way to the 1970s? Well, to help me answer that, I'm joined by Nicholas Jones, who was the BBC's industrial correspondent in the 1970s and 80s, and Alfie String, chief economist at the New Economics Foundation think tank. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Nicholas Jones. I mean, I saw a smile and perhaps a wrinkle play across your face when we saw those pictures. How similar is it now to then?
Well, they're very similar because, of course, you saw the rubbish piling up in Leicester Square. You saw the grave diggers strike in Merseyside, which left those coffins unburied. What we saw was targeted strike action in the 1970s because, of course, there was so much anger on the part of the workers. They had had 4 years of pay policy and they refused to accept 5%, and they were pushing their way through it. And, of course, there were targeted successes. So you're quite right. In the long term, of course, there was that clamp down on the unions. But in the short term, they did drive a coach and horses through Jim Callaghan's pay policy. That was why Margaret Thatcher, of course, was rounding on him so firmly. And in 1978, Ford workers demanded 25% and got 16.5% and then carried on striking for another 9 weeks. That's right. And of course, the petrol tanker drivers, a very famous group, they got 22%. And in the end, you see, although Callaghan had tried to force through this 5%, the grave diggers, which we saw, got 14%, and the local authority workers all got 11%. So this was the difficulty that Callaghan faced. But do you think we're heading in that direction this time? Well, we're certainly in a position where there are very powerful groups like the RMT. They're like the shock troops. And of course, I think the rest of people in public sector workers are looking at the RMT workers and saying, OK, boys, you're pushing the envelope. What's going to be the new going rate? And that's why I think there's so much sort of, you could say, enthusiasm on the part of the RMT. They know they're leading the way. Alfie Sterling, do you agree with what you just heard? And do you think this is the pendulum swinging back to where it was maybe 50 years ago or so?
I think we have to be very careful economically to draw too many parallels because there's still a lot of things that are very, very different about the current climate and what we experienced during the 1970s. I mean, for example, when people think of the 1970s, they're thinking of the period of double-digit increases in both wages and inflation sustained year on year, and crucially, with wages exceeding rising prices. So yes, high inflation, but wages actually staying ahead. We've got a very different picture now. We're in the foothills of a new crisis. We haven't seen that sustained now over a long period of time. But crucially, we are seeing double-digit price rises now, as of the most recent month's data we've seen from the Office for National Statistics. Wage increases are way below that and really failing to keep up. Indeed, we've seen the biggest squeeze on real wages on modern records.
But do you think if this industrial action continues, and we saw bus drivers in the northeast of the country yesterday getting a deal for 11.1%, I mean, slightly ahead of inflation. If this stuff continues, do you think we are going to catch up with what it was in the 1970s?
Personally, I think it's unlikely, purely because of the power of the trade unions is far weaker today than it was then. I mean, just purely looking at trade union membership, for example, where by the end of the 1970s, it was close to 50%, pushing a bit above it in terms of trade union members among all those in employment. Today, it's closer to 20%. So a real stark difference in the power and the leverage of trade unions across the economy. And that also then means they're unable to leverage in the same way and protect pay, protect conditions, which means it's not clear whether wages will actually rise fast enough to keep up with inflation, which drives a very different economic outlook.
But we've also got full employment, haven't we, virtually? So, I mean, unemployment is much, much lower than it was then.
That's right. And while I agree with Alfie that, of course, the unions are just half the size of what they were in the 70s, the important point is that in these public sector groups, like the rail workers, they are phenomenally powerful. They're getting 80, 90% votes in favour of strike action. And there's no doubt about it, they are determined to go the distance. And, of course, they're now talking about what they call synchronized strike action. So we've got a rail strike today, we've got the London transport tomorrow, we've got another rail strike. This is a new weapon, and that's why ministers like Grant Shapps and Liz Truss are promising a new crackdown on the unions. Within 30 days, she says, of becoming Prime Minister, she's going to have new laws announced to deal with the unions.
We'll get into what the public thinks about this in a minute. But Alfred, do you think the gig economy, zero-hour contracts, the way that we work these days, thanks to the internet, makes a difference in all this? So it seems almost irrelevant in the current discussions.
Yeah, we have much more diversified employment, much more varied labour market, which is one of the reasons why union density is so much lower. Back in the 1970s, we had thousands of people working in particular sectors, but even sometimes for single employers, whereas today it's much more spread across niche economies, niche production, niche services. One of the interesting things though is the Bank of England is very much thinking in terms of this could be a hark back to the 1970s, because as they're raising interest rates, one of the interesting things is they've been very clear that they're not actually trying to combat the current high levels of inflation we're seeing. They're trying to combat potential pushes on inflation in the future from higher wage growth. But they're clear that it's highly uncertain. Just as you mentioned earlier, we have very low unemployment now, just as we did in the 1970s, and we've got a price shock. What's less clear, what's more uncertain, is the way that then transmits through to earnings. And trade unions will be a big part of that picture. I think their comparative weakness today will mean we see a different story playing out this time.
Nicholas, it's interesting watching both parties, both in government and in opposition, grapple with this issue, trying to work out, in Labour's case, whether to be on the barricades or very much off the barricades. Do you think the public is on the side of the strikers?
I think there's considerable sympathy for the wish to get...
Sympathy. Yeah.
Sympathy, yes, to get pay increases that are going to match inflation. And I think people are seeing, and you picked it, Darshna Soni picked it up, didn't she, that there is quite a considerable degree of sympathy for the fact that some workers are prepared to stand up to the government. And in Mick Lynch, you see, the rail workers have got a vocal spokesman who's only too prepared to take on the government.
Alfred, do you think this sympathy that Nicholas has just outlined will survive a winter of discontent and many more weeks of strikes, if that's what it comes to?
I think it's really, really hard to predict. I think if we're talking about, the country's morale overall, which I think will play into sympathy for, for striking workers, a large part will actually rest on government, what government decides to do and how government decides to intervene, because trade unions are only part of the picture. They can be part of the conflict over wages, the power struggle, if you like, between employers and workers, labour and capital. But the wider population is also reliant on pensions, on different types of benefits, on support for services. And government has a really big choice over the coming months in terms of whether to support those services to boost them or to step back.
Dilemmas. Alfie Sterling, Nicholas Jones, thank you very much indeed to both of you.